Subcommittee will come to order. I want to start by asking unanimous consent the chair be authorized to declare recesses during today's hearing. That objection is so ordered. I also ask unanimous consent members not on the subcommittee be permitted to sit with the subcommittee at today's hearing and ask questions. With that objection so ordered, I'll proceed with the opening statement before recognizing Mr. Garrett Graves, ranking member, for opening statement. So good morning, and thank you to the witnesses for joining today's hearing on working conditions for airline ground workers. I've been on the Committee of Transportation and Infrastructure for now nearly 20 years. And I believe today, when we go back into the record, is the first hearing dedicated to issues specifically facing ground workers, the women and men who load baggage, clean cabins, and assist passengers in wheelchairs and prepare meals, among other jobs. Without ground workers, commercial air travel would come to a halt. That's why the House passed major pro-worker legislation last year to support the hard-working women and men who literally keep the airline industry and many other parts of the economy moving. We passed the Butch-Lewis Act, which passed the House in July and protects hard-earned workers' pensions and long-term financial security, which eventually was signed into law. We passed the Raise the Wage Act, which also passed the House in July and supports American workers by raising the federal minimum wage to $15 an hour by 2025. It's also my hope the House will soon vote on the Protect the Right to Organize, or PRO Act, to strengthen workers' rights to organize, bargain collectively, and hold employers who violate workers' rights accountable. A strong economic foundation for workers requires fair and secure workplaces. So while progress has been made, Congress must do more to provide oversight for and improve the pay and working conditions of ground workers, the two main issues that we will focus on at today's hearing. Even as the airline industry continues to grow and more people than ever are choosing to fly, not all ground workers are sharing in the benefits. Today, the committee will hear from labor representatives about the tens of thousands of ground workers who make less than $15 an hour, some making under $10 an hour, working long days and nights in catering kitchens or on airport tarmacs. The committee will also hear stories highlighting the unsafe and unhealthy conditions many ground workers face. For instance, a recent Communication Workers of America survey of 900 passenger service agents at Envoy Air, a regional subsidiary of a large mainline carrier, revealed that 27% of respondents rely on some form of public assistance, often that's food stamps. An April 2019 investigation by the Miami CBS affiliate revealed troubling safety and health issues in the Miami operation of a major ground support provider. Workers have reported cockroach infestations in vans transporting blankets and other supplies to aircraft, and were instructed to, quote, not waste time cleaning cabins too thoroughly, unquote, even when the workers encountered biohazards in airplane cabins. A federal investigation found the company was also exposing its employees to heat that was, quote, causing or likely to cause harm, unquote. The committee will hear from Mr. Esteban Barrios about his personal experience as an employee for that company. We'll also hear from Miami-Dade County Commissioner Eileen Higgins, who's on the front line in Miami in the effort to secure better working conditions for ground workers at the airport. I look forward to all their testimony. Unfortunately, these are not isolated incidents. These reports speak to the social responsibility and unwavering commitment to safety expected of all firms engaged in aviation. A representative of Airlines for America is with us today, and I look forward to hearing his perspective on how airlines will work to ensure ground workers are compensated fairly and protected from unsafe working conditions. The 21st century U.S. aviation system is deeply interconnected. Safety lapses on the ground threaten safety in the air. That's why it's important for Congress to further explore these issues. In a time of record airline profits and a record number of passengers traveling by air, there is an obvious now disconnect when a growing number of ground workers cannot enjoy the benefits of a system that thrives on the backs of their labor. It's my hope today's hearing will shed light on this committee's opportunity to improve the safety culture of the entire aviation industry. A safer, fairer working environment for ground workers will create a safer, stronger aviation system for workers, passengers, and airlines alike. I want to thank you again to today's witnesses. I look forward to our discussion. And with that, I'll turn to the ranking member for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I hope you agree. I see Congresswoman Shalala here. I think if she puts in about another 20 years of service, we can maybe qualify her to be on this committee. But I appreciate you being here. No, I know you're here for your constituent. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for calling today's hearing. This hearing touches on a topic that the subcommittee, and quite honestly, most airline passengers don't often think about. It's sort of the below-the-wing workers, the aircraft cleaners, caterers, wheelchair pushers. They don't have quite as high of a profile of jobs as the flight attendants, the mechanics, pilots, and others, but the services they provide are necessary and integral to the overall system of safety that are necessary to ensure that passengers do have safe, efficient, safe, efficient, and comfortable flying experiences. Across all modes of transportation, safety is this subcommittee's top priority, and we must continue to focus on that issue. Commercial aircraft accidents, fatalities are at the lowest level in history, but in the last decade, some ground workers have been injured or killed as a result of on-the-job accidents. It's important that the subcommittee hear what can be done by the FAA, by industry, and others to ensure that we're improving safety for airline ground workers as well. Contract services is an essential part of all industries, and aviation's no exception. There are many airline-related services that have always been contracted out by nearly all airlines. Others are contracted at airports where, due to the low frequency of flights, it would simply be economically infeasible to provide air service without the use of contracted workers. To the small and rural services, rural communities served, airlines provide jobs, connections, and economic opportunities. If airlines were unable to contract airside services, they would not be able to continue serving these communities. It's also crucial the subcommittee understand the role and importance of the Railway Labor Act to the United States air transportation. In Europe, near constant strikes keep railroads and airlines in a state of uncertainty and disarray. Both airlines and aviation workers in this country have thrived under the oversight of the National Mediation Board because of the efforts to promote resolution, compromise, and accommodation while discouraging strikes. Unions wishing to organize new categories of aviation employees must recognize how vital system-wide representation is to the continued success of aviation and the nearly 750,000 workers directly employed by airlines. I'm looking forward to hearing from the witnesses about the role of the critical transportation labor law. And thank you again, Mr. Chairman, for holding today's hearing. I look forward to hearing discussion and yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Graves. I appreciate that. I want to now welcome the panel of witnesses. I'll just read the names. And I guess Mr. DeFazio would like to be recognized for 5 minutes, but not to read the names. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have been on the committee even longer than you. I hesitate to say, but 32 years. And I did not make that point to have a contest with you. To the best of my recollection, as foggy as my memory may be, we have never ever held a hearing on this subject before, and it's long overdue. This is becoming a pattern before this committee. Profits over people. Look what happened with Boeing and the MAX. 346 dead passengers and crew, 1 rescuer. 347 people dead. At the same time, Boeing was buying back stock, paying dividends, and rewarding its CEO generously. He's leaving with a $63 million package. And here we're seeing the same thing for the essential people who make this industry work to get the planes and the cleaned and secure and get the baggage on board. The airlines made a collective $11.8 billion in profits in 2018. The big three have bought back $31.3 billion in stock in the last 6 years. The CEOs of the 3 largest carriers, American, Delta, United, made $37.5 million combined in 18. And according to a Skift analysis, the American CEO earned 195 times the median pay of his employees, let alone the ground workers. It would be much, much more than that. The Delta CEO earned 184 times median, and United 144. But as we're going to hear today in the testimony, many of these essential workers earn as little as $9 an hour, sleep in their cars. Some have to resort to public assistance, food stamps, They are at risk with a high rate of injury, sometimes fatal. They can't afford health insurance, and some even sell blood plasma, so to support their work habit of being underpaid. And we're seeing more and more outsourcing and more profitability. We'll hear from a labor economist today that'll say outsourcing of ground work has increased by 60% since 2001. It's a race to the bottom. And we're going to hear from folks in Miami where perhaps we have hit the bottom. An obscure firm called Julian America, I wish they weren't using the word America, provides ground support services like baggage handling, cabin cleaning for American and Delta. Julian has been cited for exposing employees to cockroach infestations, and of course, obviously, that affects the food service on the planes. Excessive heat, not even adequate, protection in terms of hearing, often dangerous and unhealthy working conditions. We'll hear from Esteban Barrios, who will testify on today's panel. He's a Julian employee who loads and unloads bags on Delta planes in Miami. He said in his written testimony, sometimes I'm lifting almost 300 bags a day by myself. My whole body hurts. My hand is constantly in pain, but what can we do? We don't have sick days, no sick days. And we can't take a day off to get better. So we take painkillers and try and get through the day. We'll hear from Miami-Dade County Commissioner Eileen Higgins, and she's going to talk about how when she went to investigate these conditions, she was actually intimidated by employees of the Julian Corporation. And then, we've seen other issues of routine exposure to harmful chemicals, violations of OSHA, communicable diseases, bloodborne pathogens, dangerous levels, as I mentioned already, a lack of hearing protection, noise, tractors that are unstable and lack seat belts, and people have been crushed. It's time we're going to shine a light on this, and it's time for this abuse to stop. In an immensely profitable industry, they can do better, and they should do better, and we will do all we can in this committee to encourage that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Chairman DeFazio. Before I recognize panel witnesses, I would note that some members, including Ranking Member Graves, has a markup in another committee, and he may be leaving because he has some amendments, and markups usually mean votes in committees, so I know he may have to pop in and out. There may be other members in the same circumstance, so I just want to let the panel know that. I want to thank our panel of witnesses as well. I'll do just quick names and titles here, and then turn to Representative Wilson for a more complete introduction of one of the panel witnesses. So we have Ms. Eileen Higgins, Commissioner of Miami-Dade County, Ms. Danielle Prophet, Vice President of Communication Workers of America, Local 3645, Mr. Esteban Barrios, Service Employees International Union, Ms. Marlene Patrick-Cooper, President of Unite Here Local 23, Dr. Brian Callaci, labor economist, Mr. Chris Harrison with Airlines for America, and Mr. Russell Brown of RWP Labor. I want to thank you all for being here today. We look forward to your testimony. Without objection, witnesses' full statements will be included in the record. And since that is the case, they have been made part of the record. Subcommittee does request that you limit your oral testimony to 5 minutes. So before we turn to our panel of witnesses, I do want to turn to Representative Wilson for an introduction of Mr. Esteban Barrios. Representative Wilson, you're recognized.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much, Chairman Larson. And I want to welcome all of the members of SEIU in the audience and all of the supporters of Mr. Barrios here today. Thank you so much for traveling for this very, very important hearing. I'm honored to introduce Mr. Esteban Barrios. His testimony before this committee comes at a time when airline ground workers are being marginalized while their employers generate record profits. Mr. Barrios has been on the front line of the fight for better working conditions and union representation for ground workers at Miami International Airport for a long time. For more than 4 years, he has worked as a ramp worker for Ulan America, an American and Delta Airlines contractor at Miami International Airport. Despite unbearable working conditions, which Mr. Barrios will highlight in his testimony, he has worked extremely hard to serve Delta customers and pursue a degree at Miami-Dade College. Deteriorating working conditions coupled with increasingly severe injuries and Ulan's culture of intimidation and indifference to workers' concerns have compelled Mr. Barrios to say, "Enough, I just can't take it anymore." Last year, he joined forces with Commissioner Higgins, SEIU, and the Miami-Dade congressional delegation to fight for the workplace and benefits that he and his co-workers deserve. In April 2019, Mr. Barrios and his co-workers chronicled their struggles in a CBS 4 Miami report, which brought their fight to my attention. I immediately alerted the subcommittee on aviation, and shortly thereafter, Congresswoman Shalala, who was with us this morning, and I hosted a roundtable discussion in Miami during which Mr. Barrios and his colleagues shared their experience in riveting detail. It was amazing. The months-long effort led to Mr. Barrios and co-workers compelled OSHA to investigate working conditions at Miami International Airport. OSHA ultimately found 8 serious violations that created unsafe working conditions. OSHA's efforts to hold Ulan accountable is a testament to Mr. Barrios' hard work and determination. Mr. Barrios, we're tremendously proud of you for your unflinching courage and commitment to fight for better working conditions in MIA. Welcome to the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, and thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Representative Wilson. I also now want to recognize Representative McCarcel-Powell for an introduction of Commissioner Eileen Higgins.
Thank you so much, Chairman Larson. And it is such a pleasure and an honor to introduce a great friend, but more than that, one of the strongest leaders for workers' rights in Miami-Dade County, Commissioner Eileen Higgins. Commissioner Higgins represents District 5 in Miami-Dade County, which represents over 200,000 residents there in Miami and parts of Miami Beach. Commissioner Higgins is an engineer by trade. She started her career in manufacturing, worked her way up to manage large departments in Fortune 500 companies before transitioning to public service. She has served as director of the Peace Corps and as a diplomat in the State Department, where she worked on economic development opportunities in Latin America and in Africa. Since she was elected to the Miami-Dade County Commission, she has been working to provide her constituents with a fair shot at achieving their American dream. It was Commissioner Higgins who, right after her special election, which surprised everyone, but it didn't surprise me. We knew she was gonna get in there because she was so committed to improving the lives of so many in Miami-Dade County. But it was Commissioner Higgins who immediately wanted to go and visit the airport after hearing about the unsafe work conditions, and she did just that. We thank her for speaking up and exposing the appalling conditions that are inhumane and terribly unsafe for so many workers at Miami International Airport. Their low wages of hardworking airport employees are just completely unacceptable. Today, she's going to be shining a light on what I think all of us should consider as unacceptable practices that occur behind the scenes at some of our country's biggest airports. I want to thank Commissioner Higgins for coming here, for bringing this issue to light to the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, and we are looking forward to hearing from you today. Thank you, Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Representative. Appreciate that, and good timing, because I now want to turn to our witnesses, and we will start with Commissioner Eileen Higgins, Commissioner Miami-Dade County. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman DeFazio and Subcommittee Chairman Larson and Ranking Member, distinguished members of the subcommittee. Thank you so much for inviting me here today. As members, you know better than most that our country's airports are completely vital to our country's economic strength. And nowhere is that more evident than in my home county, Miami-Dade, where our airport hosted over 44 million passengers in 2018. But what the passengers don't know is that behind the scenes, there is an army of workers making sure their flights get off on time. They're unloading the bags, push elderly travelers in wheelchairs, prepare the meals, clean the cabins. The jobs, they're not fancy, but our airports can't function without them. And these are the unnoticed and underappreciated workers who make our airports tick. Now, just because this work occurs behind the scenes should not give employers a reason to treat them poorly. But not all companies behave properly, do they? I'd like to tell you about how my personal experiences with one such company led me to become such a vocal advocate for better treatment and better pay for airport workers. I met with a group of Yulin America workers who described appalling conditions. So I decided I had to see for myself and joined several workers at their airport worksite where they shared even more stories. Some were worrisome, others downright inhumane, like poorly maintained vehicles that also lacked seat belts, cockroaches running free in those vehicles, having to clean up human feces and blood without gloves, like no water provided to workers on the tarmac. Guys, this is Florida. It's hot. The tarmac's hot. The airport engines are hot. What kind of company does not provide drinking water to their workers? These workers were afraid to report these issues to management because they feared losing their jobs. And I now know why they were afraid, because I was just minutes away from experiencing this top-down culture of fear firsthand when I entered the break room. A Yulin supervisor immediately ran over to us saying, "There's going to be trouble here." And then an airline manager rushed over, towering above me, shouting that I needed to leave because this was private property. No. The airport is the property of the residents of Miami-Dade County. But I didn't want to escalate things, so I left and continued on my official airport tour. This same Yulin supervisor followed us everywhere we went. When we stopped, he stopped, making sure that the workers and I knew he was watching us. It was meant to be intimidating, and it was. I was shocked. If this company is willing to intimidate an elected official, I could only imagine what it was willing to do with its employees who needed these jobs, put food on the table, and pay the rent. I sent a strong letter to the company's CEO requesting that he open a dialogue with the workers to improve conditions. I sent that letter on January 8th of last year. He did not respond. So that's when I called my congressional representatives for help, and they hosted the public roundtable with the employees that brought widespread media attention and finally prompted the company's CEO to request a meeting where he assured me the company would audit the worker conditions and that he would keep me informed as changes were made. He did not keep me informed. In October, OSHA issued the company a series of formal citations with penalties. Sure enough, the workers' reports were true. Cockroaches, true. No protection against exposure to blood and needles, true. No drinking water to prevent against heat exposure, true. Missing seat belts on vehicles, true. Falling hazards, tripping hazards, and more. The workers, 2 congresswomen, SEIU, and I pointed out these health and safety problems to the Yulin CEO long before OSHA did. The company ignored all of us, unfortunately demonstrating that our workers can only be kept safe from this company's management practices through consistent federal safety inspections. To prevent these sorts of bad actors from working at Miami International Airport in the future, I am proposing legislation next week to our county commission to create an entirely new procurement process that will force ULIN to become a responsible corporate citizen or replace them with a company that is. We ask you and Congress to do its part too and encourage airlines and their subcontractors to comply with basic standards of working conditions, local living wages, and in the case of this company, basic human decency. Thank you.
Thank you. Now turn to Danielle Prophet, Vice President, Communication Workers of America, Local 3645. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Is it working? Oh. Chairman Lawson, Ranking Member Graves, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today to discuss the health and safety hazards facing
Ms.
airlines.
Prophet, could you delay? You can pull the box towards you. The whole box will move, so you don't have to lean over or whatever you have there. Great,
Okay.
yeah. If it's more comfortable for you.
You hear me?
Yeah,
Okay.
that's great. Thanks.
Thank you for the opportunity to testify today to discuss the health and safety hazards facing airline ground service workers. My name is Danielle Prophet. I am Vice President for Communication Workers of America for CWA, Local 3645. I have worked for American Airlines subsidiary Piedmont Airlines for 15 years. I'm a passenger service agent trained as both a gate agent and a ramp agent, so I'm very familiar with both jobs. I work at the Charlotte Douglas International Airport, one of American's largest hubs. American is a highly profitable company and pays out billions to wealthy shareholders and executives. Yet American is cutting costs and outsourcing passenger service work to low-wage contractors and regional airlines like Piedmont. The impact on safety is a particular concern to me. Ramp workers who support aircraft on the tarmac face many dangers that are not adequately addressed. On the night of August 11, 2019, the worst possible tragedy occurred when my coworker Kendrick Hudson died on the job at Charlotte Airport. He was only 24 years old. That night, Kendrick was driving a tug and hit a piece of baggage that had fallen on the tarmac, causing the tug to flip over. Kendrick did not see the piece of baggage until it was too late, likely because the bag was dark and there was insufficient lighting. His death was a shock to all of us. Our local union had repeatedly raised concerns about inadequate lighting with Piedmont management. In a recent survey by CWA, 83% of ramp agents surveyed at Charlotte reported insufficient lighting on the tarmac, and 96% said that painted lines on the tarmac are hard to distinguish. The second factor that contributed was the fallen baggage. It is not unusual for baggage to fall from a cart due to closures that are missing, broken. We also have concerns about the stability of tugs. Had the tug been more stable like the newer model seemed to be, it may not have flipped over. The results of the fatality investigation conducted by the North Carolina Department of Labor have not yet been released. I have participated in the investigation, as have other members of CWA Local 3645. Our wish is that the investigation will result in much-needed improvements to make work on the ramp safer and to prevent anyone else from dying on the job. The safety hazards we face are made worse by Piedmont's poverty wages. Many agents must work long, exhausting shifts, face inconsistent schedules, take additional jobs, and rely on government assistance. All of these factors combined lead to a very high injury rate. Last month, CWA conducted a survey on safety issues with 500 Piedmont agents. 94% of agents view safety as a serious problem at their station. One central factor is the time pressure we face, with 69% of agents fearing discipline for missing deadlines. Understaffing is a key concern. 74% of agents reported they feel rushed to do their jobs because of understaffing. Understaffing also leads to missed breaks and long periods of standing for a majority of agents. On the ramp, more than half of agents said they work with defective equipment in all or most of their shifts. Our managers should address concerns when we raise them. At my station, 2/3 of the survey agents said they had reported a safety concern in the past 6 months. Of those agents, 83% said management failed to resolve their safety concern at all or did nothing to resolve it quickly. One area where we need federal action is passenger rage and assaults. a constant stressor and a danger for all of our agents. In February 2014, I was the victim of a passenger rage incident. I was cut on the hand and I contracted MRSA from the passenger's bag. I was out of work for 22 days. The FAA is not doing enough to ensure airlines are implementing the protocols on passenger rage required by the FAA Reauthorization Act. Ground service workers are not alone in facing unsafe conditions. Our partners at the Association of Flight Attendants, CWA, have many of the same issues at the 8 regional carriers they represent. On some regional jets, a lone flight attendant handles up to 50 passengers. We work together to try to bridge the gap and make this industry better and safer. There is much that needs to be done. American must address the poor lighting at all stations where this is a problem. The FAA should establish a ratio of ramp agents per aircraft so there is an adequate number of agents working a flight.
If you want to wrap up in the next 20 seconds.
Oh, I am. More broadly, American and Piedmont must commit to a comprehensive approach to improving working conditions at all stations by investing more in their employees and supporting robust labor management safety committees. I hope that the subcommittee will continue to investigate the practices of legacy carriers, the impact those practices have on the operation of regional carriers, and ultimately on workers like me. Thank you.
Thank you. I will note, since we haven't had a hearing like this in at least 32 years, I mean,
Thank you.
I'll give you a gavel at 5 minutes, but maybe 5 minutes and 20 and how to
Okay,
how to
thank
wrap.
you.
For all of you. All right. So next up, I want to recognize Mr. Esteban Barrios from Service Employees International Union. And go ahead and pull that box moves towards you if you want to, the whole box, if you want to get close to the mic as well. You're recognized for 5 minutes. Go right, point that microphone right at your mouth.
My name is Esteban
There you go.
Barrios. I work at the Miami International Airport. I'm here to talk about how here in America, an airline subcontractor for Delta is putting workers' health, safety, and life at risk. Here in America is a multi-million-dollar company owned by one of the richest families in Spain. Over there, the majority of their workers are unionized. Over here, Eileen has a bad record of mistreating their workers, including treating and retaliating against those who are trying to improve their job. I'm a ramp agent for Eileen. I load and unload the bags onto Delta planes. It is a very dangerous job. We are out in the sun, the hot sun, all day, working with heavy equipment right beside the planes. Eileen does not give us enough personnel. Sometimes I am lifting almost 300 bags a day by myself. My whole body hurts. We don't have paid sick day, so we can't take a day off to get better. So we just take painkillers and try to get through the day. I recently fractured my fingers at work. Many of my coworkers have also had injuries. I know someone whose foot was run over by a luggage tow. Someone else got a herniated disc after falling on the job, and the next day lifting 100 bags. Imagine running from plane to plane, lifting hundreds of bags in the Miami heat. We don't have easy access to drinking water, and sometimes we feel physically sick from lack of water. Eileen doesn't treat us as human beings. They think we are machines. When passengers get frustrated that they don't get their luggage on time, I want people to understand that this is why. We are doing our best, but these are the horrible conditions we are working under. I'm asking myself, why do airlines like Delta, who make billions in profit, allow this to happen? Recently, OSHA fined Airline over serious violation that could cause death and serious injuries. They include ramp workers like me being exposed to extreme heat that could cause heat stroke or even death. OSHA found roach infestation. Workers report that rushes are inside trucks that transport the cabin cleaners and carry supplies for planes. OSHA also found that ULEN had not offered cabin cleaners hepatitis B vaccines or proper training, even though they are exposed to pathogens in blood. But this problem that just stop at Miami. My colleague from Orlando Airport, Yolanda Rodriguez, is here today because she was not unconscious when she and several co-workers were involved in an accident in a ULEN vehicle that had not seatbelt. Yolanda still suffers from this illness and has trouble walking. She relies her sister to bath and feed her. In Fort Lauderdale, OSHA is investigating ULEN over safety concerns, including allegations that ULEN failed to provide gloves and make the hepatitis B vaccine available, even though workers can come in contact with possible blood-borne pathogens on the job. In New York, OSHA is investigating ULEN at JFK after a woman who was 8 months pregnant fell onto conveyor belt and was seriously injured. And just recently, ULEN fired 3 union activists as well. I'm speaking out not just for myself, but for all my coworkers who are too scared to speak out because they can't afford to lose their job. We deserve better conditions at work, but we also want our airport to be a safe place for passengers. I'm speaking out, okay. So the bottom line is, how is ULEN's behavior acceptable? Something must be done. On behalf of the thousands of men and women working for ULEN, please take action to help end this suffering and ensuring that Delta Airlines only work with responsible contractors. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Barrios. Now turn to Ms. Marlene Patrick-Cooper, the President of Unite Here, Local 23. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Good morning. Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member and members of the subcommittee, my name is Marlene Patrick-Cooper. I'm a proud member of Unite Here. We're one of the fastest growing private sector unions in America, with over 300,000 members in the hospitality industry, including 20,000 people working in the airline catering industry. I'm also privileged to be elected as the president of Unite Here Local 23. We're 20,000 hardworking women and men who work in airline catering, universities, museums, airport concessions, and hotel and parking attendants in the Washington, D.C. area. We're also in Atlanta, Biloxi, Charlotte, Columbus, Indianapolis, Denver, New Orleans, Texas, Tunica, Oklahoma, Utah, and New Mexico. Our members provide food for all major U.S. airlines, American, Delta, and United. I want to thank you first for inviting us to this hearing to give you a glimpse into the dark corner of the airline industry and to share with you the plight of our national airline catering workers. This industry has come to be dominated by 2 subcontractors, LSG Skyshafts and Gate Gourmet. Airline catering workers today are facing a twofold crisis of low wages and little access to quality health care. We're here to ask you to join us in demanding living wages and decent health care in this industry, in which job standards have doomed a generation of airline catering workers to some of the worst jobs found in our economy in this day. Airline catering workers prepare first-class meals, they load beverage carts, and they perform final security checks to keep passengers safe. Your flight cannot take off without their labor. And yet, despite performing vital work during a time of unprecedented profit for U.S. commercial aviation industry, catering workers often, too often struggle just to survive. Many live in poverty, many lack access to adequate health care, There are workers in their 5th and 6th decades of working in these kitchens who do not make $15 an hour. Indeed, nationwide, a majority of all airline catering employees at the 2 largest contractors earn less than $15, including hundreds of workers who have been in their jobs for decades. The situation is worse for workers in the South. 87% of LSG Sky Chef employees in Florida, Georgia, Texas, and North Carolina earn less than $15 per hour. 43% earn less than $11 per hour. And as an example, at Dallas-Fort Worth, American Airlines' largest and most profitable hub, the airline made $1.3 billion in profits in 2017, representing 30% of its total operating income. Yet, the catering workers who are serving American there are making less than $9.85 an hour. And the median wage income is $11.35. And this is not just an American problem. Catering workers at Delta and United Hub are also struggling to make ends meet. Whether they work in the cold food preparation and spend their shifts in 40-degree refrigerated rooms, or whether they drive trucks without air conditioning, even in triple-digit temperatures, this invisible workforce requires a health care plan to take care of their bodies under these harsh working conditions. Only 34% of U.S. workers at LSG Sky Chef and Gate Gourmet were able to afford the employer-provided health insurance in 2018, and only 7% covered any of their dependents. According to a survey of our 224 of our airline catering workers, 25% are uninsured, and 1 in 5 of them rely on government-funded programs for their and their family medical care. It's unacceptable that working men and women are forced to resort to public benefits while serving an airline industry in the midst of a years-long run of record profits. This treatment is especially outrageous given the billions that American, Delta, and United are giving back to their shareholders through dividends and through stock buybacks. Surely 3 of the 4 largest, most profitable airlines on the planet can afford to do better. Our members are fed up, and they've shown that they're willing to act together. Over the summer, 15,000 airline catering workers at 33 airports voted overwhelmingly to strike as soon as it becomes lawful. You will see in my submitted testimony the stories of many workers, in their own words, about the struggle just for them to survive day to day, their battles to care for themselves and their families in the absence of attainable health insurance. I hope you will look at these stories. In them, you will see the shameful treatment of these catering workers. It's time for American, Delta, and United Airlines to take responsibility for improving conditions for this large and important workforce. We urge Congress to help to end these intolerable conditions. They are a stain on the airline industry, and if left unchecked, it could reflect poorly on the people we elect who stand by and let so many workers suffer. This year, American, Delta, and Airline, they can and they must do right by airline catering workers. They should require the contractors to pay the workers living wages. They should demand that they provide decent and attainable health insurance, and that they ensure that one job is enough for these workers to live in dignity. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Patrick-Cooper. Turn now to Dr. Brian Callaci. Is that the pronunciation? Okay, Dr. Callaci, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Hi, my name is Brian Callaci. I'm an economist and a postdoctoral scholar at the Data and Society Research Institute. I want to emphasize that the views I express in this testimony are my own and should not be construed as representing any official position of my employer. I want to thank Chairman Larson, Ranking Member Graves, and the other members of the subcommittee for the opportunity to discuss the report, Fishing in Flight, that I authored for the Communications Workers of America. I've included a copy of the full report in the official record. So the domestic airline industry provides an excellent laboratory to study several of the trends affecting American workers that have become of intense interest to economists and social scientists in recent years. These trends include, first, outsourcing or fishering, the use of subcontractors to replace work previously done by direct employees, Second, growing industrial concentration and its two faces, monopoly power over consumer prices and monopsony power over wages and other input prices. And finally, financialization, which is a term describing the prioritization of shareholder interests over the other stakeholders within the firm. Now, I'll begin with an anecdote. I think that's a good way to illustrate things before I get to the data. Several years ago, American Airlines outsourced 500 wheelchair attendants at Miami International Airport to a contractor called Ulan America. Now, it is possible that Ulan, through specialization, was more efficient at that activity than American Airlines was. But another advantage of outsourcing that work to Ulan was that Ulan paid lower wages than American Airlines. And what's interesting is that when the airport enacted a living wage ordinance that raised the wages of employees of service contractors, American reversed itself and then insourced the work. So it's unlikely, just in terms of a laboratory experiment, that the contractor became more and then less efficient within a few years. Avoidance of a living wage law seems to be the variable that describes the decision to outsource and then insource. Now, workers in the airline industry have been affected actually by two distinct types of outsourcing. On one hand, airlines have increasingly outsourced ground and passenger service work to third-party contractors. On the other hand, legacy carriers have been turning to outsource regional airlines to fly an increasing share of routes. Now, if you've ever flown one of these connecting flights, legacy carriers minutely control the operations of regional airlines to an extent virtually equivalent, especially from the consumer's perspective, of full integration. Yet customers and workers of regional airlines are treated as customers and workers of separate firms under many of the important applicable laws. The report documents some trends in employment and wages in the airline and outsourced airline service industry. So I'm just going to describe just a few of the highlights. First, we can see clearly from the data that airlines are increasingly turning to third-party contractors, as the outsourced share of employment, conservatively estimated, has grown from 19% in 2001 to 30% in 2018. Direct employee wages, that is, wages of employees who work directly for airlines, are above the national average for all workers and have been rising since 2009, while outsourced employee wages are below the national average and have been stagnant in that time. They have not risen. Meanwhile, heavily outsourced occupations in the airline industry have lower wages. Just looking, comparing the 2 years, 2008 to 2018, just looking at some of the occupations, we can see that an increase in outsourcing of 10% from 2008 to 2018, just across those 2 years, across a selected group of occupations such as baggage porters, customer service reps, cargo agents, is correlated with a decline in wages of 5 percentage points. Meanwhile, employment of regional airline workers has been growing as a share of total airline industry employment, and regional pay scales are far below legacy wage scales. American Airlines does lead the pack in terms of regional outsourcing. They operate 54% of their domestic flights through regional carriers. And as just one example of the wage gap between regional and mainline operations, according to Department of Transportation data, while mainline flight attendants average around $50,000 per year in salary, regional flight attendants average less than $30,000. So there's quite a big gap there. And a similar gap exists for ground service workers. And the increasing substitutability of regional for mainline jets due to improvements in jet technology threatens to increase the pace of this type of outsourcing. We could see more and more workers in the lower wage scales. Pressure from shareholders and financial markets across the American economy, across industries, has been a major driver of outsourcing. Institutional shareholders have pushed managements to outsource more activity while demanding a greater share of corporate profits, leaving less money on hand to invest in, say, innovations, research and development, the skills and wages of their employees, and all those other things that firms can spend their cash flow on. United paid almost $8 billion in buybacks since 2013, Delta almost $11 billion, and American $12.5 billion. The decline of the U.S. collective bargaining regime has removed the major force that could counter these trends. First, the falling share of workers and unions across the economy has removed the primary source of countervailing power against large corporations. And second, the rising use of contracting arrangements excludes these workers who are outsourced, like the wheelchair attendants at America, from being able to bargain, and it reduces the effectiveness of traditional firm-level collective bargaining. Policies to restore worker voice within this fissured industry would seem to be an appropriate response to these realities. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Callaci. I now turn to and recognize for 5 minutes Mr. Chris Harrison of Airlines for America. Mr. Harrison, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Larson, Chairman DeFazio, Ranking Member Graves, members of the committee, Thank you for the opportunity today to testify on behalf of Airlines for America, which is the trade association for the leading passenger and cargo carriers in the United States. My name is Chris Harrison, and I am a partner with Ogletree Deakins. I've practiced in the area of aviation law for almost 15 years now. A little background on U.S. Airlines. They employ approximately 750,000 full and part-time workers globally. They support more than 10 million U.S. jobs. Thousands of these are ground service workers. There are approximately 28,000 total flights a day that are flown by U.S. carriers, and these are flown in the United States to over 500 different airports. And some of these are rural airports that you've heard about, such as Tupelo, Mississippi, and places like that. And then some of them all the way up to large airports like JFK and LAX. Each airport has unique requirements that the airlines have to meet when they fly to those airports, and sometimes they're different. And while the diversity of the operating environment may differ, the airline approach to how they handle their business does not. Airlines take great effort to comply with all federal, state, and local laws. They also routinely monitor the practices of their contractors to make sure that they're following those laws. Now, safety has been and will be the airline's #1 priority, and that includes passengers, that includes its employees, and that includes its contractors. They take that very seriously, both on the ground and in the air. The commitment includes ground employees that we're talking about, or ground workers that we're talking about today. Their commitment to safety includes them as well. Airlines have adopted a policy of continuous safety improvement, and there's a number of ways in which the airlines do that. For example, there are programs called ground safety awareness programs that implement a non-punitive way for employees to come forward with safety concerns, and there's a panel of people at the company. That includes labor, that includes management, and when employees have an issue, they can, in a safe place, come bring that issue forward and have it addressed. And the airlines look at that, and again, labor is part of that panel, and they look at opportunities to improve things that happen. They look for trends, they look for either specific instances or trends, and try to figure out what's a way we can improve a process to make things safer. A4A also participated on behalf of the airlines with OSHA on an airline ground safety panel. And this took place during the entire Obama administration. It was over approximately a 10-year period total. And included in that panel with OSHA was A4A, the Regional Airline Association, airline ground companies and contractors. The unions also participated in that panel. So you had the IAM, the TWU, and the AFL-CIO all participated for 10 years in that panel. And over that 10-year span, the panel met regularly to review and endorse best practices in both airport and ground safety. Information that came out of that panel was distributed to over 1.6 million workers, and that included a number of different things that I can address later. But that panel, I think, did some very good work. The OSHA came out after the panel was over and during that process and said that it was absolutely a collaborative success. The AFL-CIO made a statement as part of OSHA's release that said the panel furthered the shared goal to ensure that all workers return home to their families each day as healthy as when they went to work. Now, like many other industries, ground airlines do use contractors. Sometimes the contractors are other airlines. Sometimes it's regional. Sometimes it is third-party contractors for a variety of services. And these contractual relationships benefit airline customers by enabling air carriers to provide more comprehensive services. I think Chairman Graves mentioned this, but sometimes airlines, for example, fly to a small airport. There may be a flight that comes in at 6 a.m. and leaves. There may be a flight at 6 p.m. It wouldn't make any sense really for an airline to employ someone and require an employee to commute from wherever they're coming from, come in, work 2 hours, leave, and then at the end of the day at 6 p.m. come back in and work another couple of hours and then leave. And so in those situations, airlines very often contract for that kind of work. That way there's a third party that either can combine that with other carriers, and that way the employees get a full shift, and it's much more efficient. Airlines are committed to their employees and to their contractors. They will continue to hold their contractors to follow the law, federal law, state law, and local law, and they're committed to doing that, absolutely. Thank you for this subcommittee for allowing A4A to testify, and we appreciate the opportunity to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Harrison. Now turn, and I appreciate your patience, to Mr. Russell Brown, RWP Labor. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Larson, Ranking Member.
Sure you turn your microphone on.
Chairman Larson,
There you go.
Ranking Member Graves, and distinguished subcommittee members, thank you for having me here. My name is Russ Brown. I'm a retired airline employee with 25 years of service. I've worked below the wing in laboratory services, water service, baggage handling, and air freight, above the wing as a ticket counter agent, a gate agent, and a passenger service agent. I am now a labor relations expert with hundreds of cases to my credit. My experience includes Railway Labor Act. I am proud of the fact that I started my professional life driving the laboratory services truck, or what we affectionately called the honey wagon. The experience gained in that job and other positions I previously mentioned gave me character and appreciation of teamwork I value today. Although I did not make a lot of money in this entry-level position, I appreciated the job and grew and prospered. I am here solely representing myself and not on behalf of any airline or airline vendor. My testimony will focus on what I perceive this hearing to be about, as it covers several different topics listed below. Number one, tarmac safety as it relates to staffing and the environment. Number two, economics of airline vendors and regional airlines in small, medium, and large markets. And number three, Railway Labor Act and unions who are frustrated about how negotiations work through the National Mediation Board. The tarmac, which we commonly refer to as the ramp, every piece of equipment is staged and moves in preset fashion. Airplanes always have the right-of-way. The ramp is monitored and kept clean, as even a small bolt can be sucked into a jet engine, causing damage. These challenges are known, and the airlines account for them and train for them with safety as the primary focus. The number of personnel it takes to work a plane from taxi in to push out is based on the equipment's size. In an industry where on-time performance is measured and subject to public criticism or potential fines, staffing properly is essential. Most airlines operate what is known as a hub and spoke route system. Different airlines have picked high-volume cities as their hubs. The hub city can be a thriving, robust operation, whereas a small market may not have enough business to staff a full complement of ground employees. Therefore, airlines rely on subcontractors and/or regional airlines to fulfill the operation. We are currently in a time where we enjoy the best unemployment rate in our nation's history, around 3.5%. Therefore, the demand for employees is very competitive. The market will generally find its own value. Earlier, Dr. Callaci spoke on the negative impact of outsourcing. Dr. Callaci uses a report he authored, Fishing in Flight, as evidence. After reviewing the report and back-checking some of the data presented, I found his body of work to be unpersuasive, overgeneralized, and at times misleading. For time purposes, the committee will need to refer to my written statements for the examples. There are many inaccuracies in the report. I take no pleasure in disparaging anyone's hard work, but I do believe inaccuracies should not be shared with this committee. Additionally, I would caution reliance on this report by the committee for the purposes of taking any kind of legislative action without a more comprehensive assessment of its validity. Labor relations in America's railroads and airline industry are regulated under the Railway Labor Act. The act was passed by Congress in 1926 and expanded in 1936 to include airlines. In order to avoid disruption of America's transport network through strikes and other kinds of work stoppages, the act imposed mandatory mediation and gave the president the ability to order workers back to work. Like the National Labor Relations Act, the Railway Labor Act allows unions to organize workers for the purpose of negotiating a collective bargaining agreement as the workers' exclusive representative. Right to work does not exist under the Railway Labor Act, and until recently there was no mechanism for airlines and railroad employees to decertify a union. The previous administration changed the voting rules and how votes were counted to allow easier unionization. In conclusion, I urge you to concentrate on the following: Ramps are dangerous, and airlines should never cut corners with safety and should always be looking for a better way. Airlines may have a solid grasp on what it takes to continue safe operations. Number two, outsourcing and regional airlines are highly important pieces of America's transportation network. They are not replacing mainline jobs, but rather filling jobs that would not exist otherwise, but for outsourcing. Number three, the Railway Labor Act is the law of the land to protect employees' rights and ensure America's commerce continues without disruption. Number four, finally, and although I did not discuss this earlier, corporate campaigns have become a model and practice of labor unions like the Service Employees International Union and Unite Here. Such corporate campaigns typically involve generating negative media or public attention against a company. In the case where a company is a subcontractor, the negative attention is usually directed against better-known contracting companies like airlines to increase union leverage at the bargaining table. The system only works if both sides live up to their legal obligations to negotiate in good faith, and the National Mediation Board must continue to do its job and mediate to a resolution. In my experience,
Thank you, Ms.
shall
Brown.
help, which is the terminology that the Railway Labor Act uses for a strike, does not occur, there are no winners. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Brown. Thanks. I'm going to open up questions now from members. We'll go in order, and I will start. I recognize yourself for 5 minutes. First off, for Commissioner Higgins. We've heard a lot today about what can Congress do to help local jurisdictions like Miami-Dade County tackle some of the problems that you've outlined with from your own investigation.
Well, certainly we appreciate all the work of OSHA, because often, as we know, we hear stories from workers, and we can't verify them on our own. You can't verify them, I can't verify them, but the federal government coming in and making sure that when we're hearing tales of this, we're actually believing them and then verifying that they're true. That was extremely helpful to us at Miami International Airport. So we went from storytelling to fact verification because we had the official citations. The other thing that I think is really important, as you can see, is we're sometimes shuffling workers back between subcontractors and airline subsidiaries, all trying to figure out how can we get the lowest wage going. At the municipal and local level, sometimes it's very hard for us to require airline subsidiaries and certainly for airline subcontractors to comply with living wage standards, particularly when airports are on public property, right? So Miami-Dade County, for example, if you're contracting with us, we have a living wage because we think that's what it takes to keep people out of our public hospitals, out of the lines for affordable housing, off the rolls for SNAP benefits. And we struggle very, very much to have airline subcontractors as well as airline subsidiaries comply with those. And we all know this is an extremely diverse country. We have, in the state of Florida, of course, we've got very inexpensive places to live and very expensive places to live. And Miami, unfortunately, is one of those spots where it's pretty pricey. So the idea of getting to what we have in our living wage is a package of around $15 an hour, whereas if you don't provide health insurance, it's at least $15 an hour, and if you do, you can pay a little less than that. That's what we as elected officials believe people can start to pay their rent at, and right now, we're not always able to make that happen. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Patrick-Cooper, I was concerned to learn that Unite Here in 2018, with your survey cited, found that the rate of uninsured airline catering workers in Seattle was the third highest among 21 major cities. Can you comment on why some cities lead others in the survey?
Sure. So the survey was taken of several of our members in various cities. And one of the things that we reiterate and say over and over again, it's a vicious circle because they are low-wage jobs and unaffordable health care. So as a result of that, many of our members, they tend to rely on government-funded programs for their health care. Many of them are uninsured. Many of them, As I say with the vicious circle, is a low-wage job. You have to get to work. You have to provide for your family. And as a result of it, some of them still go to work sick. Some skip medical care for themselves, including surgery. I mean, one of our members, Shonda, and I mean, others working multiple jobs. She is a member in Detroit. She works with one of the subcontractors and another employer in the airport to be able to pay for health care for her and her child. Many of them travel out of the country to get health care because it's unaffordable here in the United States, which, you know, someone working here in our country and have to go to another country to get affordable health care. And other government funded programs that they rely on food stamp. So it tends to be a vicious circle, and it's like a bleeding that we just cannot plug up. It has to be fixed, and we feel very confident that the airlines really, they do have a horse in this race. They can do something about this. They just have to have the will and the want to do it, because these are, as I said earlier, some members have worked for decades. 9/11 came, and as a result of it, the airlines have bounced back. We've heard in the report earlier on the profits that they're making, but our members are still left behind, and they're suffering like today is still 9/11. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. We'll turn now to Ranking Member Balderson. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here this morning. My question is directed to Mr. Harrison. Mr. Harrison, thank you for your testimony this morning. You claim that the contractual flexibility airlines have allows them to enter new markets and enhance competition. You argue that without this market balance, service to some communities would no longer be economically or operationally feasible. In your opinion, what communities would lose service and would be hit the hardest if airlines were not able to contract with other airlines or service providers?
Thank you, Congressman, for your question. Obviously, I don't have a specific list at hand. What the impact will be felt, I think, at most by the smaller regional airports, Tupelo, Mississippi, Fort Wayne, Indiana. All those smaller airports where either, typically it's a lack of frequency. If they were not allowed to subcontract and they were not allowed to use contractors, the airlines couldn't do it efficiently, and essentially you're not going to fly somewhere you're going to lose money at. There are government programs like the Essential Air Service and those sorts of things, but typically smaller cities don't allow as much frequency, and you can't really effectively do that. And I can certainly get you additional information if you'd like on that, but the smaller communities and maybe even some mid-sized markets might lose service altogether, or there might be a loss of frequency or a change in the number of flights that come in and out of there each day.
Okay. I appreciate that. If you get some stuff to our office on that, please.
Thank you.
My follow-up question to you is, in your testimony, you say that airlines take great effort to comply with federal, state, and local laws. You also mentioned that airlines routinely monitor the practices of their airport ground service contractors. Can you expand on the processes airlines have in place to actively monitor the practices, the working conditions, and services that are provided by the contractors, please?
Certainly. Thank you. First of all, that language is typically written into the contracts that the airlines have with the service providers. First of all, they have to comply with all federal, state, and local laws. That includes wage and hour laws, that includes safety laws, that includes OSHA, all the applicable laws that apply. That's written into the contracts. What airlines typically do as a broad issue is they'll go out and monitor. They'll audit. So airlines usually have fairly substantial quality assurance programs that monitor themselves as well. And these quality assurance individuals and auditors will go observe conditions and look to see if they find anything. If they do find an issue, those are typically addressed. Again, in the airline industry, it's a human endeavor. And there are going to be issues that you may find. Not everything's perfect. But when you do find things, that's part of the continuous improvement. You see something, you see an issue specifically, or you see a trend and you immediately address it. There are also ways for employees to come forward and bring those issues, and that includes both internally and also even with the agencies. You know, the employees, we've talked a lot about OSHA and their coming onto properties and doing certain things. I think that's a good example of OSHA doing their job. Employees can go to OSHA, can raise issues. OSHA can come out and they have the power to fine employers and deal with those issues and try to get those resolved.
Do you feel there's anything more that the airline themselves that they can do and kind of take that initiative before OSHA has to come out?
They do, and I think the airlines, and I didn't mean to imply that the airlines are just relying on OSHA to do that job. They go out and they monitor and they go audit and do that regularly.
Okay, thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, I yield back my remaining time.
Thank you. Recognize Chair DeFazio for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. To Mr. Brown, you talked about unions engaging in this distorted kind of corporate campaigns that corporations often use to bust or prevent unions. Do you think that what we heard from the commissioner and from the workers and the OSHA fines, that Julian was just doing a great job and they were just smeared by a corporate campaign?
Sorry, I can't speak to any individual situations like that. I'm unfamiliar with everything
Right,
that was
but
going
you were
on at
broadly brushing the unions as engaging in this distorted corporate campaigns, and what we have here are OSHA fines, documentation. You know, I mean, I just, you know, that was a pretty broad brush, and you also, of course, were, you know, you wanted to pick some points with the economist on the panel, and I would note that the Airbus is not certified to carry 240 people. If they're putting 240 people on one of those things, I want to know about it because they'd be outside their certificate. So thanks for that. Dr. Callaci, $31.3 billion of share buybacks. Now, who benefits the most from share buybacks?
Who benefits from share buybacks are people who own shares, which are disproportionately, even including the beneficiaries of pension funds, are disproportionately wealthy. So it's a redistribution of wealth to people that already have a bit of it. And it also leaves less money. There's reams of social science research on this, particularly from Bill Ozonik at UMass Lowell, on how it leaves less money for investing in things like employees and skills, in training, in new technologies. Yeah.
So do like these airline corporate CEOs, do they generally vested with shares? So would they be beneficiaries of their own buybacks?
Right, so that's the other part. Because executive compensation has become so skewed towards compensation in shares and share options, it's a way of compensating executives. I mean, I think I also want to draw a distinction.
Is that a way of avoiding taxes? I mean, why as opposed to paying them a higher salary?
Well, so there's different, exactly, there's different tax treatments of different types of compensation. Incentive pay, so being paid in shares is one of the ways that they're incentivized. I should also point out that unlike even dividends, which are another way to reward shareholders, buybacks don't reward long-term investors. They reward people getting out, right? They're buying the shares back. They're not giving it as a reward to long-term investors.
Okay. And then to Ms. Patrick-Cooper from Unite, you talked about the mediation with LSG Sky Chefs. When did this negotiation start?
So one of the things we appreciated of the mediation process that we're going through right now, of the mediators' efforts to bring both sides to an agreement, but in reality, excuse me, this takes years, and this is a hardship specifically for low-wage workers. It comes across as a heavy burden. So our goal is to escape poverty, not to disrupt travel. So, by getting released from the RLA mediation process, we believe that is the only path to settlement for us.
So you would have more flexibility to take more decisive action if you want.
Absolutely, by being able to enforce our first right amendment.
Yeah, okay.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have another meeting, but thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The chair recognizes Representative Smucker of Pennsylvania for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Barrios, for being here to share your story. I was in construction industry for years, and it can be a dangerous job as well if proper precautions are not put in place. And as an employer in the industry, we were focused on ensuring the safety of our employers, and we had, or of our employees, I should say. We had individuals leaving their families, working at our job site every day, and we wanted to ensure they went back in the same shape or better shape home to their loved ones every single day. And so we took it personally when there was an injury that affected the lives of one of our employees. I don't know Yulin. I have no idea. In fact, I don't know. In fact, this could be, I don't know if the chairman would want to address this. Was Yulin asked to be part of this hearing here today?
You can address your comments to the.
I know. I just in case you
wanted.
in case you wanted to answer that question.
I appreciate the opportunity. You can ask witnesses questions.
Okay. Thank you. I suspected that may have been the case. I do not know Yulin, but I can tell you this: there's a reason that this hearing wasn't held here for 32 years, because every day there are hearings along this line in a different venue. And at a venue that would be take input from all sides, including the employer. And we have laws in place specifically to ensure that your rights are protected. When there is a bad actor, my experience has been that employers, for the most part, really do care about their employees, about the safety of their employees. I don't know whether Yulin does or not. But certainly there's a judicial process in place. There are laws in place that ensure that bad actors are held accountable. For instance, you mentioned fresh water. I know, in my experience with OSHA, that is a requirement. Perhaps this is a question for Ms. Higgins. When you saw those kind of conditions that you described today, did you complain to OSHA about that?
When I went after my airport tour, and I indeed was able to verify that there's no access to water on the tarmac for anyone working on the ramp, no matter how long they're out there. I wrote a letter to the CEO of Yulin, who lives in Miami, so he's located there, expressing my concerns and just asking him to get together with the workers to try to see if some of these things could be worked out. I mean, some of them are simple, right? If you were CEO of Yulin or I were CEO of Yulin, we could figure out how to strap an igloo cooler to the back of a truck with the bungee cord like every construction vehicle.
Were you aware there are laws in place to address that specific issue?
Yes, and it took a little while, but OSHA finally did come in.
So did you make a call today?
I did not make a call to
Okay,
OSHA.
all right. I mean, clearly, there are laws in place. There should be laws in place.
Absolutely.
And there's a procedure for employees, and I understand in some cases employers may feel their job is threatened, but there are procedures in place to hold employers accountable when they're bad actors. And again, I don't know whether this is the case or not, but what I do know is this is not a fair procedure to any company to hold this kind of event without having the opportunity for them to participate in it as well. So it's, I'm disturbed that this is being presented in this way without hearing all sides of the situation so that we can make proper judgments, and it's not being done in the place where it should be. Mr. Callaci, is it? You talked about the idea of contracting with other entities. So I come from construction. That happens all the time. Are you suggesting that is an arrangement that we at the federal level should discourage or actually set laws to prevent?
I absolutely would not suggest that. It's okay to contract, and there are industries, you know, the entertainment industry, certainly construction, that work on that model. The issues that I point out is, first of all, in this particular industry, contracting out is increasing. So it's not something that we've seen at the same level throughout the economic history of the industry. It's been increasing, and the wages are lower in the outsourced occupation. So the same job pays different depending on whether it's contracted out.
What are the
I'm sorry, your gentleman's time's up.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
I just remind folks, it's Dr. Callaci for everybody. It's been mispronounced a couple times. Callaci is the name. Apparently, labor economy is his game. Recognize Representative Lynch for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And I really do appreciate you holding this hearing. I think we need to put a spotlight on this issue, and I think today's one of those days. Full disclosure for the witnesses, I'm former president of the Iron Workers Union back in Boston. I actually worked 20 years strapping on the work boots, so I'm a former union steward, so I sort of relate to some of the stories I'm hearing out there and the struggle that's out there. I joined Congressman Brown. He and I were on the picket line with, one job should be enough at Reagan National Airport several months ago, and saw a lot of familiar faces out there during that day of action. I worked very closely with Brian Lang, who's Hotel Restaurant Workers, Local 26, and Unite here as well in the Boston area. And I think that in this industry, we have taken away the right to strike from many workers in a realistic way. So it really is a question of the relative power of employees to negotiate with their employer. And it's greatly imbalanced, I think, for most ground workers at airports. Again, full disclosure, my brother-in-law works at Logan Airport in Boston. He's a member of the Teamsters Union. He drives truck, and I'm familiar with the struggles that they have on a regular basis just to maintain decent standards, working standards, good conditions of employment along those lines, and also with the food workers and others. And I firmly believe that one job should be enough, and the way we're treating our workers there right now, at Reagan National with the food workers, we haven't really given people an opportunity to bargain in good faith with the appropriate level of power on the part of our employees. And, our government has a responsibility as well. In many of these critical industries where public safety is involved and the operation of, a major airport, an international airport is involved, the industry tells us and the regulator tells us that, this is so important, we can't have workers walking off the job because they're unhappy with their working conditions. So we force workers to continue to work, even though they have the right to grieve and bring their complaints. We don't give them enough power to resolve them. And Mr. Callaci, I know you're a labor economist. You see this dynamic in this industry. I think you're keenly aware of the issues here. How might we rebalance this so that the industry actually listens, that the regulators actually listen, the employer actually listens to the concerns of the workers? Because I think that's at the heart of this. People aren't listening. And I know there are laws on the books, and the gentleman from the other side of the aisle is right, there are laws on the books, but getting those laws to work on behalf of the people that were meant to protect is quite another issue. So if you could just illuminate some of the problems that you see
in this struggle?
Sure. And right before I answer that, I just want to just point out that Mr. Brown made some comments about inaccuracies. I just remembered in my report. At some point, if we could get to, I would love to speak to those and learn more about what they are. I don't think there are any inaccuracies in the report. I was pretty careful. But anyway, to answer your question, so the way to, I'm going to speak in broad terms, not super detailed policy proposals, because I'm an economist, you're not a policy specialist. But clearly what's happened here, and it's happened in other industries in the economy, is that the traditional firm-level collective bargaining, establishment-level collective bargaining regime has broken down. When a job is outsourced, the walls, basically the boundaries of the firm, act as sort of a wall around where the profits are. So who's the most profitable entity in the airline industry? It's the legacy carriers. The more work that's outsourced, that means that workers at those outsourced companies can't collectively bargain over or access those enormous profits that are sitting at American. They're going to the shareholders, or they're going to the executives, or in some of them, maybe even shared with direct employees. But the problem is that when we have I'll diagnose the problem as I see it. When we have a firm-level collective bargaining regime that doesn't allow workers to bargain with the entity or to have some countervailing power against the entity that really controls their working conditions, it's not working anymore. And there needs to be some way to restore worker voice and some countervailing power in the industry.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
I recognize Mr. Ranking Member Mast for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. Ms. Patrick-Cooper, I would like to have a conversation with you. I choose you really for no other reason than I thought you spoke most passionately, and I enjoy speaking to people that speak passionately, even if we don't agree on everything. We know that we both care, and so it's for that reason that I want to have a conversation with you on this issue. One of the things that stuck out in your remarks, I want to give you an opportunity to clarify, is that you said somebody should only have to, one job should be enough. Somebody should only have to work one job. Now, I just want to know, so you clarify for yourself, do you only want somebody to have one job, or it's just your belief that any one job, any job that exists out there has to be enough to pay every bit of a person's life needs?
Yeah, thank you very much for that question. I mean, to reiterate, what the core of it is that everyone who goes into a workplace, they're going there to keep a roof overhead, to put food on the table for someone, to put clothing on the back, and if you have a family and you're working multiple jobs, it bears down on your family breakdown because you're not there with them. You can't afford it. And I mean, think that, as I said earlier, this vicious circle, not being able to take care of themselves, their medical needs, not being able to take care of their children's medical need. And one good job with decent wages and affordable health care, that really, I mean, for folks who live in here in America, that should be our American dream.
So any one job that exists in this country should pay the total needs for any person, any family.
Absolutely. Workers should not have to be working multiple jobs, skipping family care, skipping medical care, having to go to another country for medical care because they can't even afford it in our country. And that's our premise. Within all the bargaining that we do for our members, our goal is to raise the standards for wages and benefits so our members can really work in dignity and be able to take care of their family needs.
Do you believe personally that level of skill should correlate to somebody's wage? As an example, one of my first jobs was working in a car wash. It was cold. It was in Michigan. I was really doing nothing other than operating a pressure washer gun to spray debris off of vehicles. Totally different skill level than what I needed when I was in the military. So just a simple question, should wage be correlated to skill level?
So I, too, started out as a rank and file worker. And one of the things we do know is that when we start into entry-level jobs, as the question you're asking right now, the wage would correlate to that, but have someone having an opportunity to continuously make a living, because at the end of the day, the workers are the ones that are at the lower end of the profits that the company is making. They're the one that's really doing it. So your question is, the wage level,
yes
it should
no?
correlate to it, but it should be a decent living wage.
But it should correlate to skill level.
Correct. And in all of our collective bargaining agreements, we have different classifications that are on different different wages as to the question that you're asking.
Should it correlate to applicable education?
You said education?
Yes. Should your wage correlate to applicable education based upon the work that you're doing?
So in our job skills, it's about the experience and knowing how to do the job. You can have someone who don't have a high school diploma who can do the work just as well as someone with a college degree. So it's
For some jobs.
Yeah, it's about the skills, ability to do the job, because everyone is able to be trained. If the companies put training programs in place, almost anyone can do the job if the company have a training program in place to give them quality training.
So you don't think it should apply to applicable education given the job?
It depends, but at the end of the day, we need to be sitting down with the employers to make sure that we're part of making sure what that wage rate should be. We don't want someone to have to work 3 or 4 part-time jobs because the employer is saying that they don't have X number of education. So the company in its bargaining process should be with us to figure this out, because we're not going to bargain a job for someone to not be able to at least have a living wage.
What about work ethic or attitude?
Work
ethic or attitude? Should wage be correlated to work ethic or attitude? Different people work at different levels of output depending upon their attitude, how they feel in life. Not everybody works the same.
No, and at the end of the day, one thing I can say, what we really truly believe in, if you have the skills to do the job, your pay should be based on that.
Thank you for the time, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Chair recognizes Mr. Representative Brown for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank the panelists today for sharing your views and perspectives with the subcommittee. Last July, along with my colleagues, and I think the chairman mentioned this in his open remarks, we passed the Raise the Wage Act, which would gradually raise the federal minimum wage to $15 an hour. This important legislation will provide more than 33 million Americans with a wage increase, boosting the economy, narrowing the wage gap, and lifting 1.3 million Americans out of poverty. I firmly believe that good wages are just one component to ensuring long-term prosperity for our communities. I think things like job certainty and security, good job training, which goes to upskilling and providing even greater wages is important, affordable health care benefits, sound retirement plans, all ensure that Americans have the tools to exceed and provide for their families. And I understand that some of the panelists have ongoing contract negotiations, and as members of Congress, I think that we need to be mindful that those negotiations are private, but also that we need to address these issues in a fair and balanced manner. We just come from it from a different perspective, but I think these priorities that I just mentioned that have been discussed by others should be considered both in private negotiations as well as the work of Congress. And it would be my expectations that these priorities, these values, would be incorporated in the conversations, the negotiations, the outcomes of those negotiations, and the work of Congress. Ms. Parker-Cooper, I'd like you to talk a little bit, and I apologize if you did when I was out of the room. As you know, many members of Congress are bouncing back and forth between multiple hearings. But I'd like for you to talk a little bit about facility modernization and the workforce experience for your members. We're moving into the 21st century, and we should ensure that facilities and working conditions reflect that. Can you provide insight into the typical working conditions that catering workers might face and some of the challenges they encounter on a daily basis? What improvements would caterers like to see in the workplace to enhance their productivity, but also worker morale? And we know that good wages and benefits ensure long-term prosperity. What else would the caterers like to see in regard to modernization and infrastructure?
So I think I want to make sure I understand the question you're asking correctly, but so.
In short, what investments need to be made in the facilities to increase productivity and morale and improved working conditions?
Yes. So we do know that our members, since 9/11, and the profits that has gone up on one side versus the workers, that in itself plays a big key piece in the morale. When the workers are knowing that they're doing more work and they're not reaping the benefits, the profits that the company's making. So as far as the morale goes, that's in the temperature of the workers. But one thing we do know we could speak on is that the workers in the airline industry, they're the worst treated. They are, the airline catering, I'm sorry, excuse me. They're the worst treated, and they are earning the least amount of wages within this industry. And the trainings that our members are getting when they go into these jobs, there's two different ways that our folks are. They are producing, assembling food to go on the planes, and then we have all the members who are driving these trucks to deliver the food from this facility onto the plane. And our members are proud. I mean, they've still been there even since 9/11. I made a reference to Shondaland behind me earlier. She's been working in Detroit at that airport for 9 years. And she has had to get a second job in that airport with another employer. Her morale, her personality, she come in every single day, has a 13-year-old daughter who she's providing for and taking care of. Even in spite of these working conditions, she's showing up every single day and doing exactly what her employer is asking her to do. And she's taking on this second job to make sure that she's able to take care of her daughter. I hope I answered your question. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Brown. I recognize Representative Fitzpatrick for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to all the panelists for being here, for lending your expertise. We really do appreciate it. I wanted to loop back to the subject of healthcare. Ms. Patrick-Cooper, you're getting a lot of the questions today, but you did reference this in your statement, so I wanted to address it. If you could just expand upon that for the committee, where the gaps are, specifically with the bargaining process, and if companies will not bargain a fair agreement with you and your workers, wouldn't the next step be for the National Mediation Board to release you and the employers for mediation?
Thank you for that question. And you're right, we are in mediation with both Gate Gourmet and Sky Chef, and we're very appreciative of the mediators' effort to bring the sides to an agreement. But, because of the Railway Labor Act, there are certain work actions that we are not prohibited to do because of the law. And this process can take many years. And for low-wage workers, this is a heavy burden going through this process and hoping that we can get to an agreement on both sides. Our goal out of this is for our members to escape poverty. We don't want to disrupt travel. What we're asking for is a release from the RLA mediation process so we can exercise our first constitutional right. We feel that that will be the only path for us to get through a settlement instead of this process that we know can take many years.
Thank you for that, Ms. Patrick-Cooper. Mr. Harrison, in your opening statement, you had mentioned commercial aviation's participation in the OSHA ground safety study that occurred, I believe, from 2008 to 2018. If you could share with the committee some of the positive results of that panel, and how did the industry work with the relevant partners in labor, specifically TWU?
Certainly. Congressman Fitzpatrick, I thank you for your question. And I think that was important to note, that it was a collaborative effort. It wasn't just the airlines showing up and saying this is the way things need to be done. They were working with the unions, with the RAA, with the ground service contractors, that some of which are kind of being talked about generally today. And I think it was a very good collaborative effort. What came out of it was a number of things. And again, it was over a 10-year period. They developed approximately 15 what are called toolbox talks and fact sheets that discuss best practices for using things like belt loaders and tugs, carts, pushback vehicles, high-lift trucks. And these are things that can be used in day-to-day operations. So when you go onto a shift, you can talk about and remind employees, here are the things you need to be careful of and watch out for. There were also the development of 5 guidance documents, including those on cold and heat illness identification, distracted driving on the ramp and on airport roadways, and on the functions of airline vehicles. There was also a case study done on the hazards associated with the operation of high-lift box trucks. And again, this information was distributed, and some of the materials that came out were distributed to over 1.6 million individual employees over the course of that work. So A4A is very proud of it, as I think is OSHA and the other members that participated, including the unions.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Representative Fitzpatrick. Recognize Representative Stanton for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and I do want to say thank you for holding this important hearing with the level of federal investment that we have in our nation's airports, including the airport that I used to lead as mayor of Phoenix, Sky Harbor Airport in Phoenix. With the level of investment that we have and the level of investment that we will be making, we hope in the near future, we do have a great interest in learning about the working conditions of people that work at our nation's airports, both public and private. So I think that this hearing is very appropriate, and as a member of Congress, getting educated about those working conditions is very important to me. First, Mr. Callaci, you indicated earlier maybe you wanted a chance to respond to Mr. Brown, didn't have a chance to fully respond. I wanted to give you that opportunity now if you wanted to take it.
Well, we haven't spoken to what the inaccuracies were. Could I yield to Mr.
Oh, I'm
Brown?
sorry, well, I'll save that for another time. I thought you had a specific question
I can
regarding.
respond to the written testimony if that would be appropriate.
That's all right. We can see. I always want to make sure you had a full opportunity to provide testimony if you wanted to respond to anything in particular. One of the unique issues we're facing in Phoenix, unfortunately, is extreme heat as it relates to climate change and climate change-related issues. Unfortunately, temperatures are rising, and it makes working conditions very, very difficult. And so, President Patrick-Cooper, I wanted to have a chance maybe to talk about that. The folks in the catering industry at Sky Harbor Airport who are working in that extreme heat, maybe talk about how that affects their health. Or whoever would be appropriate on that question, please. You feel comfortable answering that question about the impact on extreme heat on working conditions at Sky Harbor or airports where there is extreme heat? Please.
It's not working.
Just push it once. Push it once.
Is it working now? I represent ground handling workers, and we work outside in Charlotte Douglas International Airport. And we work in 100-degree temperatures and extreme heat. I did want to make reference to what Congressman Smucker said earlier, that we have OSHA standards and that they can report to OSHA. But I do want the board to know that OSHA doesn't have a heat standard, and there's also standards like OSHA doesn't have a lighting standard. In our case with Kendrick Hudson, when he died in the low-level lighting at the Charlotte Douglas International Airport, that's what we're requesting, because there's gaps in the OSHA standards that could protect workers in our group.
Okay, I appreciate that. I know it's a unique consideration, and as we make continue investments in our nation's airport, take into consideration how we can improve working standards for those who have to work in situations like in Phoenix where there is extreme heat is something I'll be looking towards. Thank you very much. I yield back.
All right. Seeing none on the Republican side, we'll move to Representative Payne from New Jersey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I just want to also, as was raised, the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Smucker, asked about OSHA requirements and rules on water. We make sure dogs have water, period. We make sure animals have water. So to think that there needs to be an OSHA requirement if there's not water is just absurd. I'm probably never going to get to my questions responding to my colleagues, but also, Mr. Harrison, in your testimony, you paint a very cooperative picture between labor and the industry. You know, everything seems fairly rosy based on your outlook, but I'm trying to figure out why all these people in red t-shirts are here if things are so rosy. they have not come from Florida, wherever they've come from, just to sit here because things are rosy. So that would be my observation. There obviously is some issue and some problems with what is transpiring between the workforce and the incredible margins of profits that the airlines are making. I believe the number was mentioned in the billions of the profits at the airlines. So to have people that, yes, a question of skill level, fine, all of that, blah, blah, blah. But in this country, people should be able to make a living and raise their families. That's the American way. And that profits now are getting in the way of that, outsourcing getting in the way of that, is an issue for me. Ms. Patrick-Cooper, I'm proud to represent New Jersey's 10th Congressional District, which contains the Newark Liberty International Airport. I'm also proud to represent the nearly 1,500 airport catering workers who are part of your organization. And it deeply troubles me to hear from your testimony that people are working for low wages and cannot afford their health care. I strongly believe that every person in this country should have a fair opportunity to succeed, and that a living wage and affordable health care are an integral part of that goal. What do you believe Congress should do to help these workers, and what are the risks if Congress does nothing?
Thank you very much for that, what we feel is a very obvious observation of our members. What we're asking is for Congress to tell the airlines to take responsibility for this workforce of airline catering workers. We're asking Congress to urge the National Mediation Board to move us toward release. And thirdly, we're asking Congress to make sure that the airlines know that they can solve this problem. They can be part of lifting these workers out of poverty so they can actually truly live and feel like they are Americans and live in the American dream. And they just need to have the will to do it. So we're asking Congress on all those three levels to help us in this situation and help our members, which is why you see these red T-shirts here, because they're here on behalf of many of our airline catering workers who are much below those wages as you just cited. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I was part of an action back at Newark Liberty International Airport in 2012 when there were issues around baggage workers and catering. And I will continue to strive to make sure that every American that works hard has the opportunity to live in this country and benefit from its greatness. And with that, I yield back.
Can I just add that?
I'm sorry, we'll have to move on to the next question. Thank you, because I'm sure you have opportunities. We'll have a second round, perhaps. But I'll go with Representative Napolitano, and barring another person on the Republican side, Representative Titus will follow Representative Napolitano. Recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Barrios, in your testimony, you talk about dangerous working conditions of the employer Spanish company Eileen has created. It seems like Eileen has a bad reputation and a bad record. Can you discuss further specific safety problems that you and your colleagues endure or face on a job? Why has the employer not addressed these issues, or have they?
Gracias. Thank you for your question. En realidad,
I can understand Spanish.
Ya, en realidad el empleador ha resuelto algunos problemas,
The employer has resolved some of the issues,
pero no todos.
but not all of them.
El problema es que han esperado a que haya accidentes, a que haya grandes problemas de seguridad para poder resolverlos.
They've waited until there have been accidents or great issues with safety for them to start to address issues.
Y yo creo que las leyes deberían impedir que esto suceda, que haya muertos, que haya heridos, que haya problemas de seguridad para entonces actuar.
The laws should not allow for there to be great injuries or fatalities for action to be taken.
Otros problemas que todavía podrían existir
Other problems that can continue to exist
son problemas de contactos con materiales peligrosos,
Other issues that can continue to exist are contact with materials that are dangerous,
falta de suficientes guantes adecuados
not enough safety materials like gloves,
y, por ejemplo, como mencioné, las vacunas de hepatitis B para evitar problemas de salud.
and the vaccines like hepatitis B vaccine.
Are those required of the company?
¿Eso se requieren por la compañía?
Bueno, yo supongo que OSHA lo habrá pedido, ¿no?
I presume that OSHA has asked for them to do that, and it is a requirement.
When?
¿Cuándo pidió OSHA?
OSHA, cuando yo supongo que lo haya pedido. Yo supongo
Yeah,
que OSHA lo haya pedido.
Mr. Barrios, even though you're speaking Spanish, please still speak into the microphone for the record.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
Yo supongo que OSHA haya pedido estas cosas.
Sí, pero ¿cuándo?
Bueno, antes de llegar a la conclusión.
¿Qué año? ¿Cuándo?
Este año pasado, 19.
19. Y todavía no ha actuado, haven't done anything to bring it up to date or to address those?
In 2019, he supposes that OSHA addressed or brought up these issues in the fall.
Do you know if it has same conditions occur in other airports?
¿Y estas mismas condiciones ocurren en otros aeropuertos?
Bueno, aquí hay ejemplos de personas que han estado accidentadas
There are examples here in this room today of people who have suffered accidents
porque trucks, o sea, camiones de Evelyn han estado sin cinturones de seguridad.
because the trucks that
Well,
Uline operates don't
If
have.
OSHA has required these things to happen, when are they giving the company to comply with the,
¿Para cuándo
taking care of the
está
conditions?
pidiendo OSHA que ellos corrijan estos problemas?
Esto no lo sé.
I don't know that answer.
Esto no lo sé. I don't know this answer.
Gracias. Ms. Cooper, would you be able to provide insight with working conditions currently confronting caterers on the job, just beyond the low wages? I assume that they're prevailing in the area, but are they complying?
Yes, and specifically at the Dallas hub, as far as working condition, we have experience because it's very hot in Dallas in the summertime, and the trucks that are driven from where the food is prepared to bring it to the plane, air conditioning was being ripped out of the trucks, and our members were driving back and forth in the heat.
Did they take care of those conditions?
I'm sorry?
Did they take care of those conditions or remedying them?
Well, they took care of it because our members, they demanded. Our members went into the boss and demanded that these trucks be provided with air conditioning.
Yeah, and how do you feel this affects the traveling public?
I'm sorry, how do I feel it affects?
The traveling public, us who fly on the planes.
Yeah, no, we feel that it affects it very greatly because we feel that safe working conditions should be something that's very key for our members to be able to come in and do what expected and asked of them.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. The chair recognizes Representative Titus for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank all of you for being here. I know you face great challenges in this industry, and I represent Las Vegas, so that's a tourist destination that depends on what you all do. and that you are safe on the job, and that translates into a good experience for our visitors. We want them to have a good trip from the minute they leave home until the minute they land, so even if you're not customer-facing, what you do has a great impact. One of the areas that I've been concerned about lately is the safety of travelers with disabilities. We've heard, we know that there are certain reporting requirements in legislation that we passed, and this is a growing issue with the disability community that wants to travel just like everybody else. The latest statistics show that airlines lose or damage 29 wheelchairs a day. That's a day. And some of these mobility-assisted devices are very expensive, or they're built just to fit a certain person, and if the person lands and they're not available, that's going to greatly affect their trip or their business or wherever they're going. We gave the Department of Transportation the authority to fine airlines, but there hasn't been a single enforcement since 2016. The airlines are aware of this because we know they've been paying off some people $2.6 million in 2016, and that number is increasing. But we don't really have much evidence that there are plans in place or that there's training in place. I wonder if you all, maybe Mr. Barrios or the airlines, could comment on how you're dealing with this, how you intend to improve it. Are members on the ground getting enough training, or is that just kind of a management handout, best practices? Would you all address that for me?
Okay. I would like to address that. From the regional standpoint, we don't have the manpower to do the work that's required as the mainline counterparts. For instance, if you are working a Boeing aircraft, I'm sure the mainline carriers might have 6 or 7 people working. We might have to do that same aircraft with 2 in the smaller stations like a Wilmington or a Greenville, Spartanburg. So in some of those situations, 2 people might not be able to handle the wheelchair, which is why it could be. The training, there's really not a lot of wheelchair training. I can honestly say as a ramp agent, I don't think we get a training on wheelchair. I think the real issue comes from the airlines not having like a big brother to monitor. Everything is being self-monitored. So they're getting away with it, which nobody is over top of them saying, hey, you have to do this, this, and this, and if you're not doing this, you'll be fined. And I think that's part of the problem.
Thank you. Mr. Barrios? Lo siento, no hablo español muy bien. Un poquito, nada más.
En el caso de la rampa,
In the case of the ramp,
ahora, después de que OSHA dictaminó sanciones para Yulen,
after OSHA dictated citations on Yulin,
tenemos una lluvia de trainings.
we have a rain of trainings,
Trainings frente a la computadora.
trainings in front of the computer,
Pero
but
antes, y muy poco antes,
right before, not very long before,
las personas nuevas iban directamente a la rampa sin ningún entrenamiento.
people would go directly onto the ramp with no training.
Y la rampa es un lugar muy inseguro y muy peligroso.
And the ramp is a place that's very insecure, very dangerous.
Incluso hoy todavía hay personas que llevan un tiempo y no han hecho un solo entrenamiento.
And including today, there are people who are working on the ramp, my coworkers, who have not received one single training.
Entonces, la pregunta es, ¿por qué esperar a que haya el accidente para entonces tomar medidas?
So the question, as I see it, is why do we continue to wait until an accident happens until we act?
Y si aquí hay personas que están accidentadas
And there are people here who have been in accidents, who have been injured,
y somos afectados,
and our lives have been impacted.
¿por qué la empresa tiene que venir aquí a decir que es mentira lo que estamos diciendo?
Why is what we're saying being questioned?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
You recognize Representative Brownlee for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank all the panelists for being here. This has been a very informative meeting and appreciate all of your efforts to travel and to be here. Mr. Harrison, you talked about in your testimony the fact that the airlines really operate under a model of continuous safety improvement, that safety is always number one in terms of priorities. So when the airlines, when their contractors have serious OSHA complaints, allegations, I'm sure that's a concern for the airlines. I'm more interested in what actions are taken by the airlines to ensure that these allegations are corrected and addressed.
Representative Brownlee, thank you for your question. So first of all, I think the contracts that the carriers have with these ground service providers, provide they have to comply with the law. They can provide, certain monitoring and those sorts of things. I think the airlines, I don't really have a specific anecdotal situation to give you to say this is one and this is what they did in response. I think they're dealt with on an individual basis. So if you have something that comes up or a breach that the airlines see, I believe they address it appropriately with that contractor. And you certainly see, you have instances that happen. I mean, accidents happen, and that's part of the learning process. But I think the airlines deal with those on a case-by-case basis and try to address it. They're not ignored.
Okay, and do you know of any instances where the airlines have, disengaged from the contractor, once the contract was up to say, you're not complying enough, we're not satisfied with your performance, therefore we're gonna go out to bid to look for others? I understand in some places across the country, there's not a lot of competition, but I'm from the LA area and I know there's plenty of competition there. So do you know of any instances of that? Okay. And then in smaller areas.
Microphone, Mr. Harrison.
I don't know of any specific instances, but I'm sure it's happened.
So, in other parts of the country where regional carriers are the contractors to fulfill some of these responsibilities, in some cases they are wholly owned subsidiaries. And so I'm wondering, in terms of contract negotiations, et cetera, what role does the airline actually have over and above these regional carriers in those negotiations, if any?
If you mean, for example, does a particular mainline carrier over a wholly owned regional? So typically there are legal restrictions on the ability of the mainline carrier to get involved in negotiations like that. They're separate entities, and each entity would engage in its own negotiations.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Harrison, do you support the federal minimum wage, or does the airline support the federal minimum wage to $15 an hour that Congress passed?
So Airlines for America does not take a position on any wage particular issue. I think that's for this body to address and for the government to address. What they require is compliance. So what we ask, I think, is that our industry not be targeted specifically where they say the airline industry ought to have this particular thing. I think that's part of a broader economic discussion that this body and other bodies here on the Hill can have and is appropriate. But the A4A does not take a position.
Thank you. And Mr. Callaci. Mr. Callaci. So, talking about the minimum wage, the House passed legislation to raise it to $15 an hour. So from your vantage point, besides increasing the minimum wage, what other sort of policy, and I know you said you're not a policy expert, you're an economist, but what other recommendations do you have that counter the sort of outsourcing trends that you outline in your testimony?
Yeah, so I mean, I can speak a little bit to that. So, yeah, the minimum wage should be increased. We have now a great natural experiment of all those minimum wage increases happening in municipalities, and unemployment did not go up. But things like, for example, a living wage law, what that does is it sort of puts a brake on the outsourcing. So if you're a more efficient contractor, you can still outsource, but you can't do it just because the wages are lower. So those sorts of mechanisms, yeah, to connect that bridge between the contractor and the.
I'll ask Dr. Callaci to give a more complete answer for the record.
Thank you. I yield back.
Before we move on, I've been notified by the clerk. I need to ask for unanimous consent request. So I hope we get support on this. It has to do with that there's a translator involved with Esteban Barrios. And so I just ask unanimous consent to allow the translator, Ms. Margarita Alonso, to provide answers in English for Mr. Esteban Barrios when necessary. Great. Also, I want to apologize. We didn't get this sorted out ahead of time. That's on us, and we will do better in the future. And one final thing, I would indulge members, if you are bilingual, still allow the witness to answer fully before, even if you do understand the answer because you are bilingual, please allow the witness to answer fully before you move on for the rest of us who are not bilingual, and then we'll figure out how to deal with this in the future. Without objection, so ordered on the unanimous consent. Representative Garcia from Illinois.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to thank all the panelists who are here and all the workers, of course, as well. I've been an activist and an advocate for collective bargaining rights for workers who are seeking to improve their life, because I represent a working class district in Chicago. As a matter of fact, my district is very close to both O'Hare Airport, the busiest in the country, and I live right near Midway Airport. Matter of fact, thousands of constituents that I represent work or have families and friends who work in various ground worker jobs at both airports. So I get it, and I understand sometimes the life-threatening and physically demanding conditions that workers are exposed to, and tragically still many only make a minimum wage. Fortunately, over the past several years, airport workers have leveraged their bargaining rights. We've stood with them in Chicago. They've gone on strike, and they've eventually earned a $15 an hour minimum wage. And then that cannot be said, however, across the country, as you all are testifying here today. And not all workers make those wages at both of the airports in Chicago. My first question has to do with the outsourcing of workers from the major airline companies. This is an issue that I've been very engaged in as it relates to the offshoring of repair and maintenance jobs, but I understand it has significant importance to our domestic airline ground workforce here as well. So, Ms. Prophet, the Communications Workers of America represent hundreds of thousands of airport workers. Can you first share with the public the benefits of union representation when seeking better pay and working conditions for airport workers? And please keep it brief because I have some other questions. Muchas gracias.
Hello. I'm sorry, you wanted to know what was the benefit of having a union?
Yes.
Oh, I mean, it's been great for us because we've been able to speak up for our members to bargain better wages. When I first started at Piedmont Airlines, I made $8.60. Now their starting rate is at least $12.50. We're not quite at $15 yet, but we would not have been able to accomplish that without a bargaining unit.
Very well. And with respect to incidents like the rage incident that you testified to earlier, what it says about the causes of rage in those incidents, and what protections for agents need to be in place, in your opinion?
We need we need enforcement. We have the passenger rage bill, the FAA reauthorization bill, but the airlines are not being enforced. We still have passengers that are getting very angry, striking us, hitting us, and we don't see the enforcement that airlines are being held accountable to.
Thank you. And this is a question for either Senor Barrios, Ms. Patrick-Cooper, or Ms. Prophet. I remain very concerned about the potential efforts of major industry players to continue to rely on a contracted workforce. How does outsourcing these jobs benefit major aviation industry giants, and what do you think should be done from a public sector angle to address these workforce challenges? Y brevemente, por favor, porque se nos está acabando el tiempo.
Bueno, lo primero que pienso yo que se debe hacer es tener una regulación con respecto a lo que es el aeropuerto. Al aeropuerto, a la rampa.
So I think there should be regulations with respect to the ramp.
Porque hay muchos detalles que se escapan, muchas cosas que no están reguladas, y esto da mucha cobertura a las compañías a que actúen de manera a veces que no beneficia al trabajador, al contrario.
There are many things that are not regulated, and this causes situations where the workers are not protected.
And I want to piggyback on him. I agree with what he's saying. We need, like with a mainline carrier, the amount of employees that they allow to work one aircraft, we need regulations that if we work their aircraft, we should have the same amount of employees that have to work that same aircraft. Right now, they're doing it with contracting us. We might work a Boeing with 2 people, whereas a mainline carrier will have 6.
Anyone else? Ms. Cooper?
Well, as far as the airline catering workers and with the regulation, I think one of the things she said earlier about is the 2 airports in Chicago as far as living wages. I mean, our main concern is that we know that Gate Gourmet and Sky Chef are contractors of the of the 3 airlines. And we feel that these airlines, they have tremendous market power to be able to right this wrong, which we feel, which is where our members are unable to, live the American dream, earn the living wages, and be able to have affordable health care.
Thank you so much. Mr. Chairman, thank you for your indulgence. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Representative Garcia. One clarification, in your questioning, you did ask a portion of that in Spanish. It may have been a clarification, but we have to have a record. So just for the clerks, for the clerk and the record, could you just repeat your question that you asked but in English, the Spanish part in English?
The Spanish part was only a request that they make the responses brief.
That's great.
Thank you. And they indulged.
Thank you very much. We have to keep a record of the hearing, so I appreciate that. We'll now move for 5 minutes to Delegate Norton from Washington, D.C.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank you for this hearing. We have had hearings on major issues in the airline industries, and here we're focusing on perhaps the not so glamorous parts of.
Ms. Norton, could you get right into the microphone, please?
Here we're focusing on perhaps the not so glamorous but utterly necessary part of this industry. I ask that this article from the Washington Post, November 26, be included in the record. 12 arrested at Reagan Airport in worker protest, union officials say. Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent that this Washington Post article be put in the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
I appreciate that Ms. Patrick-Cooper of the DC chapter of Unite Here is here. I have a question that is related to subcontracting work. I'd like to know whether the United Airlines, the employees who work directly for United Airlines receive the same compensation as those who work for subcontractors. contractors. Subcontractors, among the examples I've been given is Gate Gourmet. How do the wages and the benefits of the subcontractors and those who work directly for the airline compare, United Airlines in particular?
I don't have the actual numbers, but one thing we do know is that our members are at the lower end of the spectrum as far as
I
wages.
think that these people are, I'm not asking for the numbers.
Okay.
I'm asking whether or not the subcontractors, some contract employees, and those who work directly for the airline are in competition with one another in terms of wages, or essentially regarded as being treated in the same way, even though they don't work directly for the airline.
They have different packages as far as wages and benefits. Our members are at the lower end.
They're not unionized, are they?
I'm sorry?
The subcontract employees, are they unionized?
So the two contractors of workers that are our members are with Sky Chef and with Gate Gourmet.
Yeah.
And they're contractors of the airlines. They provide the food for the airline. So there's many different employees within the airlines, with the flight attendants, the grounds ones, and ours are in the food, into the food and hospitality portion. One thing we do know is that our members' benefit packages and wages are nowhere near in line with the other employees.
With the subcontract employees?
They're not subcontracted. They're within a collective bargaining. We represent them.
I see.
Yes.
In your testimony in particular, Ms. Patrick-Cooper, and here I'm going to quote, you said, "We believe the airline's contract terms with airline carriers leave little room to pay workers a living wage." You mentioned the contract terms with the caterers. Could you expand on that? What does that mean?
A living wage and what we feel is someone able to work one job, as our theme says, one job should be enough.
But you say the airline's contract terms with the caterers. What is there about the contract terms that leave little room to pay workers a living wage?
I'm sorry, I'm not understanding.
I'm just quoting. You say, "We believe the airline's contract terms with the airline caterers leave little room to pay workers a living wage."
Yes, so American Airline, the three big airlines, they themselves have contract with Gate Gourmet and with Sky Chef, which are our members. So they're providing a service to the airline, which we feel is very correlated and key to our members being able to get a living wage, because at the end of the day, the airlines, American has publicly said that they understand that the new labor contracts between Unite Here, Sky Chef, and Gate Gourmet, that it will result in increased costs for the airline customers, including American Airlines. So we feel that they really, truly, or piece and part, can be very instrumental in us being able to settle this.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I now turn to 5 minutes, recognize for 5 minutes, Delegate Plaskett.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Brown, in your written statement, in your written testimony, you state that airport ramps are dangerous. Would you please describe some of the conditions that exist today that are dangerous for the ramp workers?
Thank you for asking me the question, Ms. Plaskett. I mean, inherently, ramps are dangerous because there's giant jet planes moving around. You've got jet blast coming out one end, you've got sucking into the other side. There are precautions that have been put into place to account for these things. You've got numerous people that have jobs to do. Caterers have to put food on the plane in a short period of time. Cabin service has to get on the plane and clean it. Laboratory services have to work the outside. New potable water has to be put on. The bags have to come off, and some go to the bag room. Some of them sent to online. And by online, I mean to connecting flights going somewhere else. So there's a lot of moving pieces, but airlines do know about all of these pieces, and they account for it. And as I stated in that written testimony, every piece of equipment is in a specific location. It moves in a certain fashion, and guidelines are put in place to account for that.
Thank you. In any of the witnesses' opinion, have the employers and contractors adequately addressed the dangerous conditions? Does anyone have a thought on that?
I would like to address that.
Sure.
No. In the situation with Kendrick, we have been constantly talking about lighting, and they have not addressed the lighting issue yet. And Kendrick died on August 11th.
And who would be responsible for that lighting?
Piedmont Airlines.
The airline or the contractor?
We are the contractor.
Or the port, the authority that manages the airport?
The city of Charlotte manages the airport, and they say Piedmont is responsible for the lighting.
Does anyone have a thought on who's responsible for that? No? And I think that's interesting because, you know, the responsibility could shift, right? We're saying it's the airline's responsibility, but ultimately the city that runs the airport, I think, has the ultimate responsibility to ensure that those individuals who are working there, who are in fact residents of their district, should be the ones that are taking care of that. I think we like to put a lot of things on the airlines that sometimes are the contractors, sometimes are the authorities themselves that are responsible for it. With that, I know we had some discussion about outsourcing. And I was hoping, Mr. Harris, you could explain the need for outsourcing. I know that it's the airlines say that it's not part of their core competence. Why do they want to stick with the core competence as opposed to outsourcing as opposed to keeping all of the functions managed within themselves?
Certainly, and thank you for your question. So I think core competence is one of the reasons that they subcontract out. For example, catering is a good example of that. I think another reason is efficiency when, for example, I testified earlier that if you're going into a small airport, there may be a frequency issue where you only have 2 flights a day there, one in the morning and one in the evening, and it's not the airline, if that's the only flights they have, it doesn't make any sense to staff it because that creates a very difficult work schedule for the employees who are trying to commute in and out. So sometimes they use either another carrier there or another contractor.
How can, Mr. Harrison, how can the airlines, because I know in the Virgin Islands, on the island that I live on, St. Croix, American Airlines outsources their gate agents and the individuals that are there. But in the end, their competence or their customer service really impacts you, the company, and really impacts American Airlines. How do you ensure that the services that you outsource are functioning properly? And what responsibility can Congress have to those individuals that you contract to make sure that they're done properly and that it isn't just the airlines that we are putting the onus on?
Well, I think the airlines contractually have a right to make sure that the contractor is performing the job well. That's audited.
Certain service agreements or service
correct.
Mandates.
Correct. And those contractors are monitored to make sure that they're complying. There's also an entire web of laws from the FAA to TSA to OSHA that are in place, and the airlines require compliance with those laws as well.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Rewarded with her patience, I want to recognize Representative Wilson of Florida for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Lawson, for having this hearing. My question is for Mr. Barrios. You mentioned in your testimony, and we all know this, that OSHA levied substantial fines against Yulin. Have the working conditions improved since OSHA citations?
Muchas cosas han sido mejoradas.
Many things have been improved.
Sí. Gracias a la colaboración de ustedes, las congresistas,
Thank you to the support from you and the other congresswoman
por supuesto, la presión de OSHA,
and the pressure from OSHA.
hemos logrado que algunas cosas sean arregladas, pero no todas están arregladas.
We have succeeded in having some things fixed at our workplace, but not all of the things have been addressed.
Okay. Commissioner Higgins, thank you so much for coming to the hearing. I was pleased to learn about your legislation to amend Miami-Dade's procurement process to include vendors' reported working conditions, wages, and notices of violations from regulatory agencies as factors in awarding a contract. What impact do you think this would have on working conditions at Miami International Airport, and how can Congress support your effort to improve working conditions?
Well, in the case of this new legislation, because we are not, we believe we're no longer able to require subcontractors like Hewlin. We have another 4 that perform the similar types of services at the airport to comply with living wage. They compete for permit at our airport. So what we're going to do, hopefully my fellow commissioners will pass this, is embark upon a new procurement process where not only are we going to be asking these companies to compete based on their technical ability to do the job, but we're going to be asking them to compete in the American style on how they treat their employees. So for example, they don't have to pay a living wage, but will they pay a living wage? Will they give access to full-time jobs rather than part-time jobs? Let's be very clear, when they only let somebody work 20 hours a week, it's because they don't want to pay for their health insurance. Is there access to health insurance? Is there a labor peace agreement in place, whether or not they're represented? So those are the kinds of things that we're actually going to let the free market compete on. We happen to know, because we have 4 out of our 5 permittees at the airport, one of which is unionized, 3 of which are not, that we do not receive these kinds of worrisome complaints on that require an actual OSHA investigation and our congresswomen to get involved with to make this happen. So certainly you could call any of my fellow commissioners and ask them for their support on this legislation, because this way at least we can do our part and work around the fact that Congress has not yet asked that airline subcontractors and subsidiaries comply with local wage ordinances.
Thank you. Mr. Harrison, why do you think the industry has failed at implementing simple measures like adding seat belts on vehicles or ensuring that the tarmac is adequately lit at night or paying a livable wage? The job is inherently dangerous, so why hasn't the industry stepped up?
So I'm speaking on behalf of the airlines. I'm not here on behalf of the contractors or them, so I can't really speak to any specific issues. What I can tell you is that airlines take safety as their #1 priority. There's a process in place for continuous safety improvement, and they look for ways to try to deal with those situations. Sometimes it's complicated because, for example, there may be an airport, I think as the representative said a minute ago, there may be an airport that's owned by a city that's responsible for the lighting. If there's an issue and something gets brought to the airline's attention and there's a problem, they'll try to deal with that, maybe with the local authority. But I think that's part of it's a continuous process to try to make things better. And the airlines have certainly engaged in that. And there's instances, I think, that have been brought up here where bad things have happened, certainly. And I think those are things that everyone can learn from and figure out how to do better going forward.
Mr. Brown, Hewlin employees have reported that they have been fired, transferred to higher jobs, and forced to eat lunch in the bathroom for engaging in union activities. Do you consider the health and safety problems raised by Ms. Prophet, Mr. Barrios, and his co-workers to be legitimate? Do you think that these complaints are true, that are the workers lying to generate negative media or public attention, which you said?
I can't speak to anything specifically. I think that the witnesses that are here, you have to take them at their face value. But, you know, for me to tell you what's happening with Hewlin in Miami, I'm not there.
I will go back.
Thank you. So are there any further questions from members of the subcommittee? I had further questions, but they've been asked by members since I had my time a couple hours ago. So seeing no other questions, I do want to thank the witnesses, all the witnesses, for your testimony today. Contribution to today's discussion was very useful, and you've given us some food for thought as well as some follow-up. So I think you should expect to hear from committee staff. I do ask unanimous consent that the record of today's hearing remain open until such time as our witnesses have provided answers to any questions that may be submitted to them in writing. All right, so ordered, and an unanimous consent that the record remain open for 15 days for any additional comments and information submitted by members or witnesses to be included in the record of today's hearing. Without objection, so ordered. If no other members have anything to add, the subcommittee now stands adjourned. Thank you.